Alright, so this is the third and hopefully final part of Chapter 12 that I'll be going through in the webcast format. So I just finished talking about Plasmodium vivax, which is a causative agent of malaria. I went through its life cycle, defined the sporozoite, the merozoite. We also defined what the definitive and the intermediate hosts were. These are all terms that you need to be familiar with. Now we're going to move on and talk about the Ciliphora. These are the ciliates. So Ciliphora or ciliates have cilia arranged in rows, and the cilia is important for motility as well as eating. So you can see the cilia here. When it's around the organism on the plasma membrane, it's important for movement. And when it lines what are called grooves, then it can be important for food. So Ballontidium coli is a member of the Ciliphora, and it is the cause of severe dysentery. And what happens is the trophozoites of this Ballontidium are going to be released in the large intestines. When they're in the large intestines, they release proteases that destroy the host cells. And after destroying the host cells, it's then able to feed on cell tissue and fragments that are destroyed. Now, I think a lot of people get creeped out and weirded out when they think about having worms or having other types of infections inside of them. I think this is the worst type of infection. I mean, it's literally releasing proteases and feeding on the fragments of you that disintegrate. This is what gives me the heebie-jeebies. Not that I especially want to be infected with worms either, but if I had to choose, no, I'm not going to choose. Okay, another group we'll talk about are the euglenozoa, and these are the euglenoids, which are photoautotrophs, so that means that they can harvest energy from the sun. And the euglenoids are have eye spots, and these eye spots tend to sense light and help direct the cell in its motility. So if we look at here as a euglenoid, we can see that it has a nucleus, it has chloroplast, it has to have chloroplast if it's going to be able to generate energy from the sun. And it also has this eye spot, which is located here. Now, if we look at a non-cartoon picture of this, a real picture, you can see the eye spot over here. So there are hemoflagellates, which are blood parasites, and these tend to be transmitted if an insect defecates while biting. And the trypanosoma, which is the African sleeping sickness, is a good example of this. So again, the hemoflagellates, the blood parasites, are transmitted if an insect defecates while it's biting a human. And I think that happens more than you'd like to think about or like to know about. So two groups of the euglenozoa, euglenoids and the hemoflagellates. Here are some representative parasitic protozoa. We talked about most of these, I think. If this helps you review what their distinguishing characteristics are or what types of disease they cause, please use it if you find it helpful. If not, this is nothing that you would have to memorize. So now we're going to talk about some antiprotozoan drugs. Again, this information is found back in Chapter 20, and this is going to be specifically on page 571. Now, for hundreds of years, quinine, which is made from the Peruvian cinchona tree, was the only drug known to be effective against parasites, and specifically it was very effective against malaria. Now, we still use quinine and some synthetic derivatives to treat malaria. So chloroquine is used to treat malaria now. Quinacrine is used to treat giardiasis, which is caused by Giardia lambi. And there's idoquinol, which is used for intestinal amoebic diseases. We also have metronidazole, and this is the most widely used antiprotozoan drug, and it acts on parasitic protozoans as well as obligate anaerobic bacteria. It's used for vaginitis caused by the Trypanosoma vaginalis, and its mechanism of how it works is that it interferes with anaerobic metabolism. Now, many of these drugs, and those drugs that we're going to talk about that are used for the helminths are still considered experimental. And so they're really only available to physicians who want to prescribe them to patients after they've been requested from the CDC, which is the Centers for Disease Control. So that wraps up the protozoans. We're going to move on and talk about the helminths. And the helminths are parasitic animals. Most belong to two phyla, either the platyhelminths, which are the flatworms, or the nematodes, which are the roundworms. So in this section, we're just going to talk about parasitic worms. So these worms, there are non-parasitic or free-living worms too, but they are distinguished from the parasitic ones in four main ways. So parasitic worms may lack a digestive system. And they don't need a digestive system because they usually just absorb their food, which is already digested from their host. Their nervous system is going to be reduced, and again, they don't need an extensive nervous system because they don't have to search for food or respond to much in the environment, because the environment within a host is going to be fairly constant. Their locomotion is occasionally reduced or completely lacking. So again, they just simply get transferred from host to host, so they don't really need to be able to find or be able to move around to a new habitat. And their reproductive system is often very complex. So we're going to have more complex life cycles, more complex jargon in this section. So let's think about that life cycles now. So because their reproductive system is complex, it means that they're going to have a very complex life cycle. And this can involve succession of intermediate hosts, 2, 3, 4, sometimes more intermediate hosts. And again, an intermediate host is where the organism is undergoing asexual reproduction, and it will eventually get to the definitive host, and that's where it can reproduce sexually. So the helminths can be dioecious, and that means that the male reproductive and female reproductive organs are in separate individuals. So you could say that humans are dioecious too. We have individuals with male reproductive parts and individuals with female reproductive parts. Now, the other way that the helminths can be is monoecious, and this is hermaphroditic. In a monoecious helminth, one animal is going to have both male and female reproductive organs. Okay, so let's talk about the platyhelminths. These are the flatworms, and they are dorsal ventrally flattened. The trematodes, cestodes are in this category, and these can cause disease or they can cause developmental disturbances. So that's what this figure is showing. So this is a frog that's been deformed by a trematode. And what happened is the trematode infected the tadpole, and at one stage of this worm's life cycle, it displaced the developing limb bud. And so limb buds are what form on a developing embryo. Doesn't matter if you're a frog or you're developing into a human, everybody has a limb bud at some point in their lives. And if that limb bud is displaced or doubled or moved someplace else, that will cause consequences for the developing limb. And in this frog where the limb bud was displaced, you can see that it has multiple limbs now coming off from, or multiple legs coming out from where this limb bud was moved around. So now the trematodes, which are the flukes, are they're flat and they have leaf-shaped bodies. You can see this here. There's their flat leaf-shaped body. If we look at an cross-section of this, we can see that they have both an oral sucker and a ventral sucker. And now these suckers aren't used to suck out food or anything like that. They're simply used to hold the organism in place. And when they do get food, they're simply going to absorb food through their cuticle, which is going to be on the outside of their bodies. So here's an example of a fluke. I'm going to point out the oral sucker here. Here's its intestine. Here it has eggs, And here it has testes, so if it has eggs and testes, would we consider this monoecious or dioecious? This is something you should be able to answer. Since I can't see you answering, I'm going to tell you that it's monoecious, right? So let's go through the life cycle of the lung fluke. Now, flukes are named for the tissue that they infect. So if you have a lung fluke, it's probably because it infects the lungs. If you have a liver fluke, it's because it infects the livers. There's blood flukes, they infect the blood. So we'll start here. This is the life cycle of Paragonimus westermanni. So here we have the definitive host, which is the human. Now, what's going to happen is the hermaphroditic adult, monoecious adult, is going to release its eggs into the human's lung. The eggs are going to be coughed up in the sputum that comes from the lung, and if these eggs somehow get swallowed by that person, they can pass through the feces and into a water supply. So, and this mechanism may sound disgusting of coughing up an egg then swallowing it, but it's pretty common to swallow sputum. Now, if they are when they are passed through the feces, this is or how this disease is going to be diagnosed is that the doctor is going to look in the feces and find the eggs. So that's how they would be identified in a lab. Now, after the eggs are passed in feces, they can, and if they're able to reach water, that's what's seen here, the eggs can develop into a stage that's called the miracidium. And this miracidium stage is free swimming. That's what's shown here. The miracidium, or free swimming stage of this lung fluke, can enter into a snail, and the snail is going to act as its intermediate host. Inside the snail, the miracidium is going to reproduce asexually, right? That's the definition of being inside of a intermediate host, and it's going to produce retiae, which contain another form of the fluke that's called the cerciae, which is seen here. So here's the retiae. The retiae contain another form of the fluke, referred to as the cerciae. The cerciae form is going to leave the snail, and when it leaves the snail, it can then enter into a crayfish. This crayfish is going to act as another intermediate host. The cerciae are going to encysst in the crayfish, and when they form their cysts, they're going to be called metacerciae. And what will happen is if a human eats this infected crayfish, the metacerciae are going to develop into the adult lung fluke. So that's a complex life cycle, right? We have the sexual reproduction that's going on inside the human, which is the definitive host, and then we have multiple forms of this organism, here, here, and here. And we have a cyst form of it in the crayfish. We have two intermediate hosts. So these life cycles can be very complex, even though these organisms themselves are not that complex. So let's talk about the cestodes now. Cestodes are tapeworms. Tapeworms are internal parasites. They have a head, or scolex, which has suckers for attaching to the intestinal mucosa of its definitive host. So here we can see the head. This is the scolex, which is the head. It has hooks, and then it has suckers as well. And the suckers are what are going to help attach it to the host. So they do not ingest the tissue of their hosts. And we know that they don't ingest the tissue of their hosts because they lack a digestive system. So instead, they're going to absorb food through their cuticles. Doesn't this seem nicer than those ciliated protozoans that actually destroy the tissue and then eat it? Anyways, it's just my bias. So the tapeworm is going to absorb food through their cuticle. And their cuticle, again, is on the outside of their body. And their body consists of segments called proglottids. And the proglottid furthest from the neck, so here we can see the scolex, After the scolex, we're going to have segments of proglottids, and the ones furthest away from the head or the scolex are going to contain the eggs. Now, each proglottid is going to contain both male and female reproductive organs, but it's really only when the eggs are laid that that this tapeworm is going to continue going through its life cycle. So again, the segment that's furthest away from the scolex is what's going to contain the eggs. But each proglottid, which is a segment, and there can be many proglottids strung together, is going to contain both male and female parts. So this is a monoecious organism. Now some tapeworms can reach up to 6 meters in length. Again, there's one scolex per animal, followed by 1,000 or more proglottids. If the proglottids are found in the feces, they can contain thousands of eggs. If a grazing cow eats the proglottid, the larvae can hatch from the eggs, bore through the intestinal wall, and then encyst in the intestinal wall. Then if a human eats the encysted meat from that cow, all of the proglottids are going to be digested. However, the scolex will remain unharmed, and the scolex is going to anchor to the small intestine in that human, and then it's going to begin to produce proglottids. So this is how the life cycle can, this is one way the life cycle can go for a tapeworm. So the definitive host for the beef tapeworm is the humans, as well as for the pork tapeworm. So again, for the pork tapeworm, the adult worm in the human intestine will produce eggs, which will be passed in the feces. And if the eggs are eaten by pigs, then the larvae will encyst in the muscles of that pig. Then the human will eat that pig, and if the pork is undercooked, then the human can be infected with tapeworm. So there's that cycle again. So let's look at these life cycles. So this is for Echinococcus granulosus. So the intermediate hosts for this are the human, the deer, and the sheep. The definitive host for this is going to be a coyote, a dog, or a wolf. So we'll start with number 1. The adult tapeworm is going to release eggs that are going to be excreted by the definitive host. In this case, it's a wolf, I think. Yes, a wolf. The eggs can be ingested by humans accidentally, or they can be, and if they're ingested by humans, humans tend to be a dead end for this parasite. So that means that the parasite can encyst in the humans, and you can have this happen, but it's not going to get any further. Because humans are not preyed upon by dogs or coyotes or by wolves, there's nowhere for this tapeworm to go, so it's not going to make it back to its definitive host. So that's why we refer to this human as a dead end. Now, if instead these tapeworm eggs were eaten by a sheep or eaten by a deer, then the eggs can hatch and the larvae can migrate to the liver or to the lungs. The larvae can develop into a cyst, and if this deer is then eaten by a dog, coyote, or a wolf, then the scolex can, everything except for the scolex is going to be digested, and the scolex of this tapeworm is going to attach to the wolf's intestine, begin producing proglottids, begin sexual reproduction again, and this is going to be the definitive host for this tapeworm. So it's tapeworms. Now we're going to talk about the nematodes, which are the roundworms. Now, nematodes have complete digestive systems, which means they have a mouth, intestine, and an anus. And most species are dioecious, so they have both male and female. So the male reproductive organs and the female reproductive organs are not in one organism. Instead, they're in separate individuals for these nematodes. Now, nematodes that are infected for humans are divided into 2 categories. those in which the egg is infective and those in which the larva is infective. For the pinworm, which is Enterobius vermin, verminalis, um, which again is the pinworm. So pinworms live in the human intestine, and the egg is what is infected for the humans, so not the larva, but the egg. Now they live in the human intestine, but what happens is the female, and you can see that the female looks different than the male. The female will migrate to the anus, where she will deposit eggs on the perianal skin. So this can be seen here. The eggs will be ingested by the host or by another person through contaminated clothing or bedding. So this is how the life cycle goes with the pinworms. Now, a diagnosis for pinworms can be made by the Gram sticky tape method, and in this method they simply use a piece of sticky tape on the skin of the perianal region. They remove it and they check for eggs. If they find eggs, then that person is infected with pinworms. Now there's a really nice TWIM episode about pinworms, and it's great because they talk about pinworms being more so a rite of passage that most kids just end up going through. And pinworms don't tend to be harmful in any way. They tend to be annoying because when the female is laying eggs, that's itchy, and so the child can be woken up because this tends to happen at night because they're itching their bottoms. And of course, most parents don't want their child to have worms, so they tend to take them to the doctor. But the point of this podcast is that worms are not that bad, and pinworms tend to clear themselves, and it just tends to be an age-related issue. So some more roundworms. There's Ascaris lumbrioxoides, and in this one the eggs are infective for humans. And it's estimated that 1 billion people are infected worldwide with this. It can live in the small intestines of humans exclusively, and it'll feed on semi-digested food. The eggs will be secreted with the feces and can be ingested by another host. The larvae will burrow out of the intestines. They can burrow out of the intestines and enter the blood, where they will be carried to the lungs where they grow. They are coughed up, swallowed, and returned to the small intestine to mature into adults. So Necator americanus, which is the hookworm, we're going to hear about a really cool TWIM podcast about hookworm. Here the larvae are infected for humans. So in this, the eggs are excreted in feces. The larvae hatch in the soil and can penetrate the host skin. If it enters the blood or lymph system, it can be carried to the lungs, coughed up, again swallowed, and carried to the small intestine. And in that podcast, we really learn about how important shoes are for avoiding hookworm. And then the last worm I'll talk about is heartworm. This is named because the adult stage is often in the animal's heart, where it can kill the host through congestive heart failure. And this is caused by Dirofilaria immitis. And this tends to affect dogs and cats, but can also infect human lungs. So that's what this picture is showing. Here are some representative parasitic helminths. We talked about some of these. You're not responsible for this table, but if you're interested, I urge you to look at it. So, anti-helminthic drugs. This section can again be found in chapter 20, page 571. So, for tapeworms, nicotinamide can be used, which will inhibit ATP production under aerobic conditions. There's also praziquantel. This is going to alter permeability of tapeworm plasma membrane. This is broad spectrum. It can cause helminth spasms, and it increases susceptibility to the immune system attack. Mebendazole or albendazole. These are also broad spectrum drugs. They inhibit microtubule formation, so they can interfere with nutrient absorption. And ivermectin. This is an anti-helminthic drug produced by streptomyces. It's effective against nematodes and mites, and what happens is it results in the paralysis and the death of the helminth. So normally, if the helminth is paralyzed or dead, it can be easily passed through the body. So that brings us to quiz 4. the end of quiz 4, I should say. So here's answers 9 and 10, or excuse me, questions 9 and 10. So IG therapy is a form of naturally acquired active immunity. Decide if that statement's true or false. Write it down. And question 10 for quiz 4. B cells can be antigen presenting cells. Decide if that question is true or false. So you should have 10 true or false answers now on a piece of paper. I want you to hand these answers into class on November 26th. I will not accept any emailed answers. You must come to class if you want credit for this quiz. Thank you for paying attention to these webcasts. I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and I look forward to seeing you on the 26th.